Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session on Net Zero from Momentum to Integrity. My name is Richard Black, and I'm a Senior Associate with the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, a London-based think tank. And with me are 4 people, and going to be 5 people who know an awful lot more about this than I do and have some very valuable perspectives to address. So just to clarify why I'm here and why this event is here, this is organised on behalf of the Net Zero Tracker Consortium, which is a consortium of 4 organisations. There's the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, Oxford Net Zero, the data-driven Envirolab in the US, and New Climate Institute in Germany. And we maintain what we think is the most definitive database there is of net zero commitments put forward by countries, states and regions, cities, and major companies. Not only what they've actually pledged, but the ingredients of that pledge, how robust they are, how much integrity they have, things like, for example, do they have interim targets, and so on and so forth, and that's all on one accessible website. Net zero is moving on very fast, of course. It was all about commitments, and now it's about integrity, and very soon it's going to be about implementation. And we've had several major interventions this year, including one just this week, actually, with the high-level expert group's report. And so we're delighted that among our panelists we have 2 members of that high-level expert group. And we're going to be taking stock really today of target setting, where we're at with that, with progress, where we're at on progress with implementation, and really more importantly, where we're at with the overall agenda of net zero. What is being looked at, who's looking at it, how it's becoming more important, how it's being verified and checked up on, and so on and so forth. So without further ado, I'm just going to ask each of our panelists in turn just to give a quick introduction to themselves, and then we'll go into some more chat about the actual content, and at the end there'll be a question and answer section, and we'd love to get your views and your questions as well. So just in the order that people are on the panel, I'll just get them to introduce themselves. Dan, over to you.
Hello. So I'm Dan Barlow. I work for BSI, which is the UK's national standards body, but I'm the founder of a collaboration called Our 2050 World, which is between ISO, the International Standards Organization, which comprises of 165 member nations, the Race to Zero campaign, and the UNFCCC Global Innovation Hub. And what we're looking to do with Our 2050 World is to accelerate momentum towards net zero using standards. On Friday, we were very pleased to publish the Net Zero Guidelines, which was a process that involved 1,200 participants looking to sort of converge and build on the momentum of voluntary initiatives and produce a common reference text.
Thanks, Dan. Jessica?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Omukuti, and I am a research fellow at Oxford Net Zero at the University of Oxford. I work on net zero, but I specifically focus on emerging markets and developing countries, and so we're quite critical of the concept, and we basically think about how net zero can be structured to address the equity and justice concerns for developing countries, but also in developing countries. I was also a member of the high-level expert group, and we launched the recommendations. So the HLEG was put together by the UN Secretary General, and we launched the recommendations for what non-state actors could do to avoid greenwashing of net zero commitments, but also to enhance credibility. And that was on Tuesday, and I'm happy to talk about that today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jessica. Tom?
Hi everyone, my name is Tom Hale. I'm a professor at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford, and I am one of the co-leads of the Net Zero Tracker, which has brought us together today. It's a great pleasure to be able to see the huge momentum that's coming out on net zero, but also to take stock of how we're doing, how cities are doing, how businesses are doing, how regions are doing, and indeed how countries are doing on this agenda. So that's what we're thinking about today. I'm also the co-chair of the expert peer review group of the UN's Race to Zero campaign, which is the effort to mobilize non-zero targets from non-state entities, where we've been looking at this question of integrity quite closely and have a lot of interesting thoughts on how it can develop going forward.
Thanks. And Angel?
Well, if I wasn't awake then, I am now. Thanks, Tom. I'm Angel Hsu, and I'm an assistant professor of public policy and the environment at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I also founded and direct a research group called the Data-Driven Envirolab. I was also a IPCC AR6 author contributing to Working Group 3 on mitigation, chapters 4, 8, and 13, all which focused on the contributions of non-state and subnational actors to global climate mitigation. So I'm really excited to give you a preview of some exciting research talking about the progress that these actors have made on climate change mitigation and their self-stated goals on the road to net zero.
Thanks. And as you've seen, we're delighted to be joined by our fifth panelist, Arunabha Ghosh. Arunabha, just a minute or so of introduction about yourself, if you would.
Good evening. I'm the last guy in town, I guess. I'm Arunabha Ghosh. I'm the CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. We're an independent think tank based in India, but we work not just with the national government, but dozens of state governments in India and also in emerging markets, especially in Southeast Asia. And as with Jessica, I served on the Secretary General's high-level expert group, and I am also a member of the UN Committee for Development Policy. And right now, CEEW is also a strategic partner to the Government of India for its G20 presidency, which we'll assume in less than 3 weeks from now.
Thanks, Arunabha. I guess you're probably the fittest man in town now, if not the last. Okay.
I ran for air quality yesterday, I can say that.
Really? Excellent course. Okay, so first of all, we're going to hear from our two panelists who were members of the high-level expert group, some takeaways, some reflections, some thoughts on what they came up with and where it leaves us now. So Jessica Omukuti first, if you would, please.
So Arunabha and I had a chat this morning, and we said we'd tag team to just talk to you about the high-level expert group and the recommendations. So what I'll do is I'll just take you through the process, which is probably a minute or two, and then I'll probably mention one or two of the recommendations, and then Arunabha will take it from there. On Tuesday when the UNSG was launching the recommendations, I got to learn about the process that led to the Secretary General putting together the high-level expert group. And here's the story. At COP26, we observed a lot of non-state actors coming out with commitments on net zero. And most of them were quite good, but there were concerns that a lot of those commitments were just basically greenwashing. And greenwashing is just saying that you will do something so amazing, but there's really no substance in it. And so the Secretary General says that he was in a meeting with an NGO or a CSO representative who asked him to actually constitute a group that would scrutinize, kind of think about what it is that a commitment has to be to avoid greenwashing and what it is that makes up a credible commitment for net zero. And so the Secretary General constituted a 17-person group to which Arunabha and I were members. And Catherine, the chair of the expert group, says that it was a group that had more women than men, which was quite good. It was regionally representative, and we had people from different parts of the world. There were like 4 African high-level expert group members, myself being one of them. We started our work, I think, in March. And it was based on, first of all, conversations between the high-level expert group, and then we opened it up to consultations with different organizations, but also individuals. And so we did consultations as a high-level expert group, but also we kind of divided ourselves and went and did consultations with the regions. And then after that, we came back and kind of opened it up for submissions from different groups. And so there was online submissions on net zero. And then we came up with 10 recommendations on what we think is important for avoiding greenwashing by non-state actors. And here, non-state actors are businesses, financial institutions, cities, and regions. And so these 3 groups of actors. And the 10 recommendations cover kind of the whole, I call it kind of the value chain of net zero, all the way from when you're thinking about setting a target, when you set a target, when you're creating your transition plans, and all the way to reporting, verification, and also regulations. And so maybe just the first two recommendations, and Arunabha will talk about the rest. The first one is the high-level expert group says that, first of all, a non-state actor should make a commitment on net zero. This commitment must be public. It should be made by the leadership of the institution, and it must be reflective of the institution's entire operations and its fair share of emissions that is needed to achieve the global goal of net zero by 2050. The second requirement is that for an entity to avoid greenwashing, it must have interim targets that are set every 5 years, but then the first interim target should not be later than 2025, because if you were following the conversation at COP26, you'd realize that a lot of corporations or a lot of non-state actors were setting targets for 2050 without actually saying what would happen in between, what they would do, and so it was net zero itself was seen as a very far off target, and so interim targets kind of break it into smaller chunks where we see what non-state entities are doing and how they plan to achieve the end goal. But then we say that the high-level expert group says that the interim targets must be in line with science, and so that is the IPCC pathways or the IEA, the International Energy Agency greenhouse gas emission model pathways, and entities must achieve 50% of emission reductions by 2030. And so those are the two initial recommendations that specifically target the emission, the net zero commitments. And I think my colleague here, Arunabha, please take it away.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. I mean, of course, I'm sure in the context of the conversation today, we can get into the depth of some of the recommendations that we brought out. But before I lay out a few more of what we've said, I want to take this moment to just say, if last year we thought of Glasgow almost like an ambition COP, and we're saying this one is an action or implementation COP. There's a third A, which is accountability. So there's ambition, action, and accountability. And if I may be provocative, I feel, and I've been saying this on a few forums here, I feel that we have entered into a world of becoming members of a mutual admiration society, that we all come to COPs and announce initiatives, whether as countries or as corporations or as cities or whatever. But we come back 12 months later and we never say, what happened to that thing that you announced last year? Instead, we announce a new set of initiatives and we again pat ourselves on each other's backs. And this mutual admiration society needs to evolve into a mutual accountability society. Otherwise, none of this is justified. So that kind of rant or rhetoric aside, what did we actually say? So one of the things that comes from this laying down the targets is this whole issue of the use of credits, especially the use of voluntary credits. So we debated this quite significantly because we saw that there's not only a dash for the kind of low cost but also poor quality credits, so to speak, but there's also a lot of uncertainty about how this is being used or where it's being, what broader social impact it's having. So we made it very clear in the recommendations that a non-state actor cannot use the credits for meeting their interim targets. But we also said that they could be counted, they could be using high integrity credits for actions beyond their interim reductions, including we strongly urge non-state actors to look at the geographies and the sectors that are underserved. So that if you are going to go down that route, not only should the quality of the credits be very high, but they are not towards reducing your own emissions, but towards investing in developing countries and in distributed energy, in hard-to-abate sectors, and so forth. So that's one issue where we try to find some balance in the different approaches. The other thing that I wanted to draw attention to is that we've made it very clear that you cannot come to a COP and announce a sort of net zero target or an initiative or whatever, and then go back to your home jurisdictions and lobby against a very different set of regulations. It's that policy incoherence that on the ground makes it very difficult to actually analyze what's going on, but actually sends mixed signals to markets, to investors, to consumers, and to governments. So we came down pretty strongly against that. A third set of recommendations that I want to draw attention to is about the increasing of the transparency and accountability. Now, again, we saw that across many of these voluntary initiatives, there was no standardization of the data or the way the data would then get further developed or compared. So how do you know that that an entity in under one initiative is doing better or worse than an entity following a completely different data protocol in another initiative? So we asked for net zero non-state actors to annually disclose their greenhouse gas data, net zero targets, and their plans and their progress towards it. But also that all this be reported in a standardized open format via public protocols and platforms, and that the disclosures be accurate and reliable. Of course, in this, we recognized, having done a range of consultations across countries, that there is a strong demand for verified verifiers. So how do you build up the capacity for those who are then meant to hold us accountable? So that is also something that we have to work on. And one final thing I would draw attention to, there were many more recommendations, is that we said the move towards net zero by non-state actors must be consistent with a move towards a just transition. These are not either or, certainly not an afterthought. And that's why we have recommendations where we ask for the non-state actors to work with the state actors and with multilateral financial institutions to actively seek projects in developing countries, to actively work on the de-risking mechanisms that can deliver and crowd in investment at scale into the geographies where the sun shines the most, but the capital does not flow. How does all of this come together? And I'm going to stop there. We have made a set of recommendations right at the end, which we call sort of accelerating the road to regulation. Because ultimately, while it is good for these voluntary initiatives to kick off, this lack of data transparency and standardization, the lack of being able to hold each other accountable, the lack of verified verifiers, the lack of the ability to actually crowd in capital in a big way in developing countries, this requires an element of a regulatory architecture. And we've even called for a task force to be established to think through that kind of regulatory harmonization across geographies. So let me stop there for now, and we look forward to getting into more discussion.
Thanks very much, Arunabha. Thanks, Jessica. It's a wonderful overview of the process. One of the things that comes up in the report several times is the important role that other bodies can have, whether they're working with cities or businesses or whatever. And I'm particularly delighted that we can have Dan Barlow speaking with us, because standards in business and so on is clearly a key way that has enhanced things in other areas of life. And so what role can it play with net zero as well? Dan?
Yeah, absolutely. So we announced, and I think what you said was really important, Tom, we're going from an ambition COP to an action, implementation and accountability one. And at COP26 we launched our 2050 world, and we said that we were going to use standards to the mechanisms we have, the levers we have, to develop a document that would help to bring clarity. And the objective of that document, the Net Zero Guidelines, shares the same ambition, and actually we name-check the high-level expert group's objectives in that document. And what we've done is we've gone through a conscious parallel activity to come up with recommendations that have been sort of crowdsourced, so collectively authored. So we had 1,200 individuals and organizations registered to be part of the workshops. We did 36 hours of workshops over 3 months and published at COP27. So we're really pleased to have done that so quickly. Standards typically take 3, 4, maybe 5 years to develop. This isn't a full standard, it's a set of guidelines developed in an international workshop agreement, but we did that in 3 months. So the reason why we think this is important is that you need to capture what the market, what the consensus is. So the way that we started that was through an assessment that was conducted by Oxford Net Zero, looking at the 33 most prominent initiatives out there, including things like ISSB, SBTI, and many others, and developed this seed document that took the best practice from all of those. And actually in that assessment we found that although there was fragmentation, there wasn't an awful lot of divergence. So it made it quite easy to write that seed document. And then we went through this iterative process of developing the document that we developed, that we published yesterday. And we think that's so important because it is collectively authored and it can be used by governing organizations, so that could be regulators or other standard setters, both in the international standards system but outside of it, to make sure that they're thinking about net zero in a consistent way. But it can also be used by any organization. So we've purposely developed it so it respects all jurisdiction, the national context, but also any part of the net zero action that you're looking to take. So we wanted to build something that was open, was doing something that no one else was doing, and respected the momentum of voluntary initiatives.
Great, thanks very much, Dan. And we can take some specifics on that later on, I think. Moving on now to Professor Thomas Hale. As Tom said, we have been part of the Net Zero Tracker Consortium for, well, it seems like a very long time, but actually the whole thing's only been a couple of years. It's just that things have moved on so quickly, it seems much longer than that. And one of the things that we've tried to do is to make the tracker also reflect to some extent what's going on in the real world, what other organisations are thinking about. So of course the HLEG recommendations are very important for the tracker itself. Tom, what reflections now have you got on how basically, well, on really what we're seeing in the real world of what the HLEG has recommended and the implications for us going forward as well?
Thanks, Richard. And can I just start by saying a big thank you to Jessica Arunabha for your work on the HLEG and to Dan for your work on the ISO Net Zero Standard. Huge, huge achievement this week to see this ecosystem of net zero standards really cohering around a, I think, quite unified view of what, at least at the high level, good net zero looks like. We see you need to have a plan, you need to have interim targets, you need to have use offsets in a way that doesn't delay or substitute for decarbonization. You need to make sure you report annually on what you do. These are now sort of, we all agree what good net zero looks like. And it's something that we in the Race to Zero campaign have been thinking a lot about, is how we operationalize these ideas into the work of the different alliances and partners that make up that campaign. For example, the Science Based Targets Initiative, Cities Race to Zero, the different financial alliances that fall under the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. So now with this kind of crystallization we've seen this week really coming into force, I think it gives us a huge boost for the next step, which, as Arunabha said, it's about implementation and delivery and operationalization. So I know my colleagues on the expert peer review group of the Race to Zero campaign, which is an independent group of experts, we're really excited to see the results coming out this week from both the HLEG panel from ISO, and I really feel it gives us a lot of material to enhance and improve our work going forward. The question, though, is how we move, as you said, Richard, from the plans to what's actually happening. What do we see in reality? And Arunabha, you put it really well. How do we go from mutual admiration society to actually thinking, where do we stand? And that's the raison d'etre of the Net Zero Tracker, to give us a real-time look at what cities, companies, regions, and also countries are doing in terms of their net zero pledges. Have they actually made them, number one? And number two, if they have made them, do they meet these sort of criteria for robustness that we've been talking about and that the HLEG has come out with, the ISO has come out with, Race to Zero asks for, all of this kind of good. How does it look? So let me be frank. The reality is very mixed. We see a huge gap, actually, between the reality of what we know net zero good looks like and what people are actually doing in practice. There's not only doom and gloom, there's some really good examples, there's some excellent success, but if you look at the whole global landscape, we also know we have a lot of work to do. So let me just share a few insights. And the good thing about the Net Zero Tracker is that any of you who might be, for example, looking at your phones or looking at your laptops can check it out right now on those screens by going to zerotracker.net and seeing which company, which city, which region, which country you might be interested in is doing. But looking in aggregate, we see some real room for improvement. For example, how many of the entities setting net zero targets have an interim target, right? A short-term, near-term target, which is a really important thing, as the HLEG has stressed. Well, it's only about a half of companies and cities that have set a net zero target that have an interim target, and about 2/3 of the regions have done so. So work to be done there. What about, for example, on the scope? Do you actually cover all of your emissions? Let's look at the companies. Well, only about 1/4 of them have said definitively that they will cover scopes 1, 2, and 3. Others have maybe said they'll cover some of scope 3 or just 1 and 2, or in far too many cases haven't actually specified, at least not publicly, exactly where that boundary might lie. So that makes it really hard to assess the robustness of those targets. And third, look at the question of offsets that you mentioned. So we have a lot of language around offsets, but very, very few entities, regions, cities, especially companies, have actually said what offsets they might be using, how much of their footprint they might be trying to offset, what conditions they might be imposing on those offsets, for example, around permanence or other kinds of metrics, biodiversity goals, social goals, other things they might care about in this space. And so it's really hard to assess then the impact of these net zero targets if we don't even have the information on what the offsetting plan might be. So work to be done on those fronts and others, and there's a lot more data in the net zero tracker to dig into. Let me just close by saying where I see this going next. And actually, one of the most interesting announcements for me this week was that came from President Joe Biden when he was here. He highlighted the announcement that the United States is going to require companies selling products and services to the United States to set a science-based targets if they're more than $50 million per year, and for all of them, even if they're smaller than that, to report to CDP. So we're seeing the kind of hand of the government, regulation, in this case procurement rules, being used to drive further net zero alignment. And that's really quite big, because it means that we're in the process of translating this, what you might call this groundswell of voluntary action, into ground rules for the economy overall. And that's where the standards that came out this week from ISO will be very important, but also where the high-level principles in the expert and the HLEG group will be so key. One of the recommendations, Jessica and Arunabha, that I found most creative and powerful in the HLEG report was this idea to create a task force on net zero regulation to try to look at this whole ecosystem of regulations coming into place around net zero and to try to make sure they cohere in a way. Because of course, as we're seeing more and more rules come out on different aspects of net zero, there's a real risk of fragmentation. And I sit in the UK, just in that one country. There's, for example, a new plan for transition plans that the government's asking companies to do, or requiring companies to do. There's disclosure rules, which came into force in June. The advertising standards regulator has punished a big bank, HSBC, because it said it had claimed net zero when really they thought it hadn't. And the government has a similar to the US, a procurement rule that requires net zero alignment. But none of those different pieces of the UK's kind of regulatory landscape are necessarily asking the same thing of companies, and that's just in one country, right? So imagine now across all the different countries. So I think the HLEG has really put its finger on a really important problem for the next generation of net zero integrity, which is about how we bring regulators together across boundaries and across different regulatory domains to try to give us some coherence on that and to ensure rigor. And when they do so, they'll come armed with the HLEG report and this consensus that's now been crystallized on what good net zero looks like. So I think it's very encouraging, even though we know from the net zero tracker how much work we have to do to actually make that into reality. Thanks, Richard.
Lovely, thanks, Tom. So last but not least, in this opening set of remarks, we thought it might be worth taking a look at the overall state of play with non-state actors across climate action, how they're actually doing. And of course, that concerns many more things than net zero targets, and it concerns many more organizations than the ones that you see before us. So Angel Sue is going to take you through some of the key numbers.
Thank you, Richard, and hopefully you can see me. I gave up wearing my tall shoes today. So thanks so much, Tom, for that overview. And following along this discussion of how do we move from the plans and the intentions of net zero into the reality. So I'm really excited to preview some exciting research that our group, along with many other here today, New Climate Institute, Tom's group at Oxford, and IDOS, Radboud University, Utrecht, and also CDP. So we came out with the first version of this report on Thursday, looking at international cooperative initiatives, in particular the Glasgow Breakthrough Initiatives and where those stand. And then on Tuesday, we will come out with this report that I'm really excited to preview for you today, looking at where we stand with respect to the progress on implementation. So this is the implementation COP. So where do city, region, company efforts stand on actually implementing their climate action plans Where do they stand in terms of achieving those interim targets that are so key? How many of them have set net zero targets? So also looking at the ambition and how close or far are they from actually meeting those goals. This is the fourth report in a series of reports that we started in 2018. And we launched the first global climate action from cities, regions, and businesses at the Global Climate Action Summit, which was co-convened by former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg and at the time California Governor Jerry Brown. And this was, I think, a geopolitically challenging time because, of course, in the United States, the national government had withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. And so there was a lot of focus on what cities, states, and regions could do to contribute and fill in those gaps in action and implementation left by national governments. And so in these series of reports, we collated a lot of data from all these different initiatives, Global Covenant of Mayors, CDP, ICLEI, all these different efforts, and we developed the first aggregated estimate of how much these actors could actually fill and narrow that emissions gap between national government, current policies, and those critical 1.5 and 2 degree scenarios. And since then, we have published 3 other reports, and then as I mentioned, the latest report will come out on Tuesday. So here's a little bit of a sneak preview and a little bit of a trigger warning. I always tell my students in my climate change class that climate change science is not all positive. It's actually pretty depressing. So if Tom was being frank, I'm going to be outright depressing. So just wanted to warn you that the picture does not look great, but I think for our panel, this is a great opener to talk about, well, what can we really do by way of the implementation COP? How can we nudge these non-state actors to follow through on these net zero commitments? So first of all, taking stock of global climate action, this is something that our report does. What we're seeing is that these numbers are kind of stagnating in terms of how many new actors, how many new cities and regions and companies are signing up to make their own voluntary pledges. And so right now, about 12% of the global population is covered in cities and regions that are pledging actions on climate change. And by population, it's more balanced. So a lot of large cities in China and Japan, they're the ones who are signing up. North America, we've got major US states, including California, which is the most populous, also committing, and then of course Europe. But then in terms of the targets covered, most of them are primarily being drawn from Europe. And so how can we better engage and bring on other actors from the global south in particular? We're not seeing a whole lot of improvement in trying to engage more actors from the global south. And then I think more worrisome is the fact that in terms of targets, if you look at the first 2 bars here on the left, the 2018 and 2019 reports, you can see the height of these purple bars. More than 6,000 subnational governments in 10 high-emitting economies, US, China, India, Brazil, Europe, of course, South Africa, and Mexico, others. We had more than 6,000 targets, and that was starting to go up. But then, probably because of the COVID-19 pandemic, you can see the number of entities actually reporting and committing to these efforts has taken a nosedive. So that's pretty worrisome. And so even though the number of post-2020 targets, so more of those interim targets being set en route to decarbonization, that has increased compared to 2018, 2019, we're seeing a huge nosedive in terms of the number of targets and actors that are taking part. So this is worrisome. But a little bit of optimism, we actually see companies heading in the right direction. So this is a more encouraging piece of data in this report. So if you look at the blue area here, these are the number of companies in our 2018 and the CDP 2018 disclosure, and you can see almost double the number of emissions covered by companies in the 2021 in green. So that's really encouraging, and you can see, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but then the trajectories of what they've actually pledged, that potential reduction. And then we're also seeing an increase in net zero target setting from cities, regions, and also companies. So this is encouraging. I would say when we started to do this analysis a few years ago, in 2020, we saw only around 800 or so cities and regions that were committed to net zero targets, and that number has almost tripled. So these numbers, I just want to caution, are a little bit different than what we have on the net zero tracker because we're including cities and regions that have populations less than 500 million. So that's, if you go to the net zero tracker and you say, hey, wait, but she presented some different numbers, that's the reason why. So that is encouraging, and in particularly places like Australia, almost the entire population is covered by net zero targets because the 8 subnational provinces and states have actually made their own net zero targets. So that's encouraging. The other types of analysis that we've done, as I mentioned through these reports, is also actually aggregating all of the targets and then looking at the trajectory of where that gets us compared to national policies. So if you're familiar with the emissions gap scenarios, this will look really familiar. Historical emissions, and then our current national policies in blue, and then the estimated impact of COVID-19 in orange, and then we have the 2-degree range in purple and the 1.5-degree range in blue. And so when we take up just looking at the commitments, so this is actually in the 2021 report where we still had those, we had more targets, but when we take all of those individual commitments and add them together, they lead to an additional 1 to 2 gigatons on top of what current national policies put us, and so that's around 4% of global emissions. So potential, a lot of potential there for these various entities to actually help us narrow that emissions gap. But then, of course, this figure, and this is what I always caveat, this is based on a huge assumption that actors actually follow through. The cities, regions, and companies actually implement the efforts to actually reduce those emissions. And so the next part of my presentation will be looking really at the progress that has been made so far. And so this is, I think, the less positive and the more sobering results. So as we can see in this map, just looking at the cities and regions, less than half, or around 42% of cities and regions are actually on track to meeting the targets that they have set themselves. And so in blue, you can see in some areas in Southeast Asia and Chile where 100% of actors, or nearly that many, are actually on track to meeting their targets. But the far more common color is this purple color or this red color where less than 50% of the entities in those countries are actually on track to meeting their targets. And so when we look at the distribution of the annual reduction, so how much they need to reduce their emissions on a per capita basis every single year, what they need to do is around 2.5%, but we're only seeing around 1.6% per year from the cities and regions. So a lot more effort needs to be done to actually achieve those reductions that would help them keep on track to meeting those targets. And then I think the major question is ambition. So there were comments from our high-level experts about the need for ramping ambition and making sure they align with these various climate change scenarios. So for this report this year, we added these trajectories. They're a little bit hard to see in these dotted lines, but we wanted to know, are the pledges that cities and regions are placing in place, and then also the companies, are they actually in line with 1.5 and 2 degree scenarios? Are they actually ambitious? And unfortunately for the cities and regions, we're actually not seeing that many of them fall below this green dotted line here for 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the majority of them. In fact, we find that less than 10% of cities and regions in the global north are actually aligned with the 1.5 degree scenario. So that's quite depressing. And so you can see those actors on track are in blue, those not on track are in red, and many of them fall far below what's actually needed. Moving on to companies, the good news is that we see more optimism. 75% of targets are actually on track to being met, but the variation is quite large depending on what sector the companies are in, what country they're located in, but the picture is overall much more positive, and companies are able to achieve about 5.8% reductions per year. So that's looking at the entire CDP database where there are quantifiable targets, multiple emissions data points, so that translates to about 1,480 companies globally. So the picture is actually a little bit more positive. And when we take a look at their ambition, we also see that the ambition is actually much better than cities and regions. So 70% of the targets are in line with 2 degrees Celsius scenarios. 42.5% of targets are in line with 1.5. So it's actually a little bit more positive. But again, it varies according to sector. And you can see a little bit more of that sector picture here, where we compared the time series. So are we seeing some improvements over time? Are we seeing those cycles of virtuous action and companies ratcheting up their ambition? And the good news is that we are. So ambition has increased between 2018 and 2021. Again, in green, the 2021, and the purple at 2018. But again, it varies quite a bit by sector. So we see the biggest jump in ambition in the materials sector, but we're seeing that it has increased from 2% in the 2018 data to 2.9% in 2021 in terms of the annual ambition. So like Tom said, it's a mixed picture. I think much more sobering on the subnational government side, But with companies, we're actually seeing some progress. But I think overall, the result is a lot more work that needs to be done to make sure that implementation and follow through happens, and so that we are not too off track to these net zero targets that more and more of these actors are making. So thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Angel. Wonderful. Well, Arunabha, let me come back to you, if I may, immediately, because as you said, the danger is that this community kind of pats itself on the back, becomes self-congratulatory. I think the data that we've just seen suggests there's no room for that. Having gone through the HLEG process and obviously been around in the field more generally for many, many years, what are your top recommendations about how we actually stop being this kind of mutual admiration society and actually really do see progress on implementation?
So, I mean, short answer is implement all our recommendations. But the slightly more challenging issue here is what can we try and do between now and, say, the global stock take, right? And building on the data that Angel has just presented. So I think, and also Tom's comments, I think it would be good if we can take actions that start tying our hands behind our backs rather than bring our hands forward to kind of applaud. So one is the regulatory route, right? So what is it that we can do over the next 12 months to at least begin that process of, regulatory discussion or regulatory harmonization or let me say standardization rather than harmonization, and see what progress we can make there. Maybe we'll not crack it all, but that would be one metric that we've acted on tying our hands behind our backs. The second is to reduce the data obfuscation. So already, even in the past week, since the recommendations came out, we're seeing a number of new data or old data initiatives or new data initiatives that are coming together to try and make things clearer. But what I would not like is, we reduce the number of, voluntary initiative announcements and we increase the number of data announcements, So what can we do between now and November 2023 to bring some harmonization of these different data and data protocol and data transparency initiatives that are already out there? So that's a second thing. And of course, from where I come and what I strongly feel about is how do we also, in the course of the next 12 months, demonstrate how companies, and maybe that can be a special section, Angel, in your next edition of your report, in line with what the HLEG has recommended, that what are you doing to drive investment into the global south? So we've said that cannot be an afterthought, that would just be part of your net zero transition strategy. So I think if these three things were done, we can say that then we are putting in place the building blocks that tie our hands behind our backs, hold ourselves accountable, but also give some credibility and build the trust that can then feed up to the more intergovernmental multilateral process for which we are actually here.
Dan, perhaps I can sort of ask you that question in microcosm as well, because within the organisations you work with, the standards organisations and the companies that then adopt those standards, obviously they first of all have to decide to take part, and then in the end those would become mandatory on them if they want to claim the standard. So how do you see this process working of moving from these sort of voluntary commitments to something against which they can actually really be held to account?
Absolutely, great question. So a big part of the theory of change for our 2050 world and the net zero guidelines is based on Tom Hale's excellent policy memo, the conveyor model, which talks about you have the voluntary initiatives that businesses that want to make a claim. Then you have voluntary initiatives that help them to do that in a credible way, and they experiment. Orchestration campaigns such as the Race to Zero that give those credibility. Then you move into this space of standards that helps to bring a huge amount of scale across markets and products, and then you move into the more binding, so the regulation. And that theory of change we sort of tried to operationalize straight away with the net zero guidelines. So the net zero guidelines will hopefully, when applied, allow those companies that are at the very top end of what they're applying to stay at the front but those that need their hands tied behind their backs to do more. And another area that the net zero guidelines are going to be really useful is through specifically in ISO, through the London Declaration. So the London Declaration is ISO's climate commitment that was made last year in September, where the ISO members said that they were going to do two very specific things. They were going to make sure that the climate science is baked in to all of the standards, and there's actually over 24,000 international standards in the International Standard Organization's catalogue at the moment, and also make sure that the voices of those most vulnerable to climate change is amplified in standards and how they're used. And I think what's really interesting is we're seeing with the international workshop agreement that we've done incredibly quickly, the net zero guidelines process, we're starting to get into a point where we're seeing a tipping point potentially for the standards space. And I mean, that's something that Tom Hale talks about in his policy memo, where we've got this ambition loop and we're seeing it develop in real time. So I think it does sort of fit those points around regulation, and we're really pleased to have supported the Pivot Point report that was published earlier this year. We're really pleased to see the recommendations that were made in the high-level expert group's report, Integrity Matters, about the regulatory task force. And we think that the net zero guidelines, because they apply to all types of organizations, including governance and those that are setting regulations, can use this document, that it will ease in regulation that is aligned to the leaders who are doing it voluntarily, and also help those laggards to be swept up by the same rules in a consistent way.
Great, thanks very much, Dan. Now, as you said, Dan, Tom, you've literally written the papers on this, the conveyor belt and the ambition loops and so on. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the HLEG report in that context. And I think there's one particular bit of that, well, there are many bits that are interesting, but one particular bit that is interesting is the relationship between the non-state actors and the governments.
It's a really interesting question, Richard, because of course the Secretary General, I think very wisely, has put together this task force which has come up with this great report on greenwashing and how to avoid it, and it's come up with strong rules. But the explicit mandate of that group, of course, was for non-state actors, for cities, for regions, for businesses, investors, etc. And as the net zero tracker shows, a lot of countries have also made net zero targets. Indeed, 90% of global GDP is covered by a country that has made a net zero target. And countries in their capacity as parties to this convention have yet to impose a kind of accountability system on themselves, other than a kind of soft review mechanism through the Paris Agreement. So I think the tool and the recommendations from the HLEG actually are of course geared to non-state actors, but they help us really think about what a path for a country should look like. Should it have, for example, a legally binding target, which we see a number of countries adopting? Should it have annual reporting? Should it have a way to deal with the offsets in an effective way? I think the science is pretty clear, as these groups have all come up, what good net zero looks like. And so that's an important, I think, milestone for the countries to reflect on as well. So I do hope it will unlock some of that reflection. Can I say one more thing, though, about what the regulation could do, Richard? Because the net zero tracker looks at publicly listed companies, so things that are on stock markets around the world. But much of the economy is actually run by private companies. One very prominent company has just gone from public to private when it was bought by a rather rich man named Elon Musk, and we're seeing that sometimes that kind of control doesn't always lead to the positive outcomes, perhaps, for the world. The Net Zero Tracker did a quick report looking at the biggest 100 private companies. It's kind of a supplemental analysis, and the findings were really quite stark. It showed that of those 100 private companies, the biggest ones, only about 30 of them had a net zero target, compared to about 70 of the biggest publicly listed companies. And if you drill down into certain sectors, the gap is even more stark. So of the publicly listed fossil fuel companies, about 70% of them also had a net zero target. Anyone happen to guess how many of the privately held fossil fuel companies had a net zero target? Any guess? 0, not 1. So this goes back to the point that Arunabha was making, the high-level expert group was made around regulation. If you don't have rules that apply to all, there's a risk the laggards will hold back the progress.
Thanks, Tom. I think that shows up one other issue, doesn't it, is that in the great civil society constituency here of people who want to monitor and boost net zero activity. There are many that have a theory of change that includes working with publicly listed companies. The number that have a theory of change for working with private companies, I think, is probably much smaller, and that's one area that needs addressing. Jessica, I wanted to talk a little bit about equity and the global south, if I may, because I mean, Angel showed us that net zero, at least if you look at the numbers, is primarily a European concept. So obviously, it is a concept that logically, in time, one might expect to come into Africa and other developing regions of the world. You talked in the HLEG report about fair shares and equity and the just transition. Could you just expand a little bit about how that works and how it can become something other than a predominantly European construct?
Thanks, Richard. I like talking about equity in net zero. So earlier this year, I think in the run-up to COP26, which was not this year, we realized that, as you said, Richard, is that net zero itself was a very Western concept. It was designed to serve Western markets, to create profits for companies that had emissions to reduce. And so we've observed a lot of pushback from developing countries where there are concerns about what net zero means for them, but also the concerns that net zero does not really encompass the desire for development, the desire for growth, but also adaptation and resilience and finance. And as Arunabha has said, the HLEG recommendations recognize that. They begin to address some of those concerns. For example, the HLEG recommendations recognize the role of credits in reductions of emissions, but also credits in, they require that credits be allocated to places that need financing the most, those people who are most vulnerable to climate impacts. But also issues of financing are also recognized within the HLEG recommendations. One thing that we are really looking into is how net zero as a framework itself is kind of engaged with in developing countries. And as you, if you remember Angel's presentation, we had Europe having so much activity, and then Africa, it was just in the south where South Africa had a bit more activity. Cities, there's some cities that had net zero commitments, but not all of them. And so we together with the net zero tracker team did a tracking also using publicly available information. And so we tracked Africa's largest 250 publicly listed companies and by market capitalization as of March of 2022. From that, we found a very interesting number. So we found like half of those companies had set emission targets. And most of those targets had been set between 2020 and 2022. This is not something we expected to find because we knew that the politics of net zero in Africa was still evolving. The countries were still trying to reconcile what net zero means for them, but also trying to identify which pathways to take in relation to net zero. And so given that 125 companies have emission targets is a very good starting point, but also we found that most of the companies that didn't have targets had plans to set science-based targets over the next 3 to 5 years. And so companies were either, those without targets were either already reducing their emissions, they were already investing in renewable energy, they were already investing in nature-based solutions, but also were planning on certain targets. And so this is a very interesting space for us because even without going into the quality of those targets, we find that companies, there's already voluntary action, at least in Africa. We don't have data on the other developing country regions, which is an opportunity for at least, the regulators, an opportunity for the standard setters to engage with this, to make sure to engage with this group, to ensure that net zero targets actually address the priorities for these countries. And in this case, as Arunabha said, it's investments. We need investments in developing countries to go towards clean energy, but also development and adaptation, and ensuring that these concerns are actually country-owned. Before I go further than that, that's it, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to pick up with Arunabha, with you on that as well, because I know CEEW, one of the things that you're doing is working with some Indian states that are working on net zero targets, and it'd be just interesting to hear, I think, that perspective that you've gained on how they go about it, what they need to make it work.
Yes, I mean, in fact, as Jessica also pointed out earlier, the expert group was created for non-state actors, which included companies, cities, and regions. But of course, a lot of our push has been on the companies, but that is not to at all ignore what cities and regions are doing. But what has been interesting for me to observe, sort of in parallel to this work on the HLEG, is the work that my own organization, CEEW, has been doing within India on looking at net zero pathways for subnational actors. So of course we've done countrywide modeling around net zero, but then we have now started working with several states, some which are very poor, some which are reasonably advanced in terms of an industrialized state. But without getting into the specific examples of states which they will come out with their targets when they politically see it right at the right moment, what I can say is that the whole issue around net zero has to fit into the broader development strategy. And this is what I've been saying for more than a year now, that net zero is not a call for an energy transition. It is a call for an economic transformation. And that economic transformation is not something that just can be imposed from the top. You have to understand it bottom up. And what does that mean? Number one, you have to build up the analytical capacity at a subnational level, so that the entities with whom you're working don't feel like this is some, parachuting in consultant telling you what to do and you just have to accept that pathway. That analytical capacity is not just a modeling capacity. It's also a pre-modeling capacity in terms of a data capacity. Sometimes the data might exist, but it does not exist in the form that feeds into our models. So just to be able to organize data architectures at a subnational level that allows for a state-level planning commission or a state-level entity or a chief minister's office to say, okay, I need this kind of information from my power sector people and from my transport people and from my industry people. That's one part of it. Another part of doing this bottom-up is looking at administrative capacity, which is that are we training the officials on the ground who have day jobs in which they are already super stretched to actually be able to think, let alone into the next 20 years or 30 years or even 5 years, look beyond a single year's budgetary cycle, because bureaucracies work on single year budgetary cycles. Now, how do you align that incentive structure to do this? The third dimension to this is the implementation capacity. Which is that, and let me give a hard example. Suppose you wanted to decarbonize the transport sector. Right? Now, these are subnational actors that might be at a fairly early stage of of their transport system. So it's a good time to come in and say, before you build out more cities with more roads for cars, you have a electric public transport system. But the business model around that has to be implemented can only happen if you have something hard placed on the ground, it's going to touch and feel and experience and run and learn from. So when you pair up all of this, the data capacity, the administrative and bureaucratic incentive capacity, and the implementation capacity, you suddenly realize that the net zero story is actually a more complicated one, but also a more exciting one that goes well beyond the work of a single modeling team. So, even within CEEW, we have these interesting conversations between the modelers and the non-modelers as to, who comes first, or and I like to say, who passes on the baton to the next. And we need to create that circular economy in a way of analytics, where then those who are doing the things on the ground can then feed that lessons back into a more nuanced understanding. So we are actually now downscaling our countrywide model into state level sort of GCAM models which then can be translated into sectoral models and so forth, even while the on-ground work continues. I'm sorry I couldn't take the names of specific states, but you know, it all begins from sitting in tiny rooms with, you know, mosquitoes biting you, and you are trying to model out a net zero pathway and an economic transformation narrative. So it's exciting if you've got, you know, some mosquito spray on.
Angel, perhaps I can ask you a final question before we go to questions and answers from the hall. So we've heard there from Arunabha about a need for one type of data, or maybe, you know, expansion in the way. You, of course, have been doing lots of the data gathering for years on this, and lots of presenting to various fora inside the UN. How do you see this field evolving? Is it a question of only more on the ground stuff, or are there exciting things that can be done with artificial intelligence, for example? What does the future hold?
I'm really glad you asked me that question, because I was going to jump in and speak to Arunabha's really good points anyways, even if you hadn't asked. So, I mean, I think everything that you're saying, Arunabha, makes complete sense. Absolutely. The analytic capacity, the implementation, the administrative capacity, that's all incredibly critical to really mobilizing the net zero efforts and what's needed to achieve these targets. But I think it's too slow. You know, I think we don't have time. We've already, I mean, just speaking from an IPCC perspective, a lot of my fellow co-authors and I are just, we're not sure that 1.5 degrees Celsius is really realistic at this point. I mean, I was looking at the data from Berkeley Earth in North America. We're already at 1.57 in North America. So to me, it's too slow. And so, I mean, I think we need to do this in the Global South to get people on board, to build that capacity on data and aligning the data, as you said, with the actual implementation, but it's just too slow. And so, I mean, I think we have to think about alternatives at this point, and thinking about how we can actually speed this process of getting the necessary information from companies, from small, medium-sized enterprises, from different institutions and local governments in the Global South, so that we can actually meet this challenge of being able to understand where is progress being made, where is not, who's leading, who's lagging, as Tom said. And I mean, I just frankly think that if we wait to try to build the capacity, then we're going to way overshoot even 2 degrees Celsius. And so, I mean, there's a lot of efforts going on right now. Bloomberg is developing their net zero public data utility. I think there's a lot of work that's been done on the standards. And I think, fortunately, some of the work that also is being done in more of these policy conversations is what kind of role can next generation technologies, so machine learning and artificial intelligence, how can we take those 33 standards, or the more standards that are proliferating, and how can we use machine learning and AI to understand patterns and trends and relationships and map those? I mean, James is in the audience, Arboretica. We partner with them on the Net Zero Tracker to try to automate a lot of the data collection, because it's really needed. And so how can we look at relationships between these different standards, so that when you have a local government or a company, no matter what kinds of standards they want to use, if they align with one standard, then you can imagine that uploading to a common data framework and model, you could have digital architecture that could then just be able to harmonize and make sense of the data for you. And then satellites, I served on a committee this past summer through the US National Academy of Sciences, and so we looked at the potential for satellite remote sensing and Internet of Things and sensors to try to help fill in some of these data gaps. And it's not perfect, but it can help develop these critical baselines on data, on emissions that we need in order to just get a baseline understanding of where people stand. So I think there's a lot of potential that can help us leapfrog. I mean, I think the capacity needs to happen in parallel, but I think at the same time, we can't put all of our eggs in that basket.
Lovely, thanks, Angel. Okay, so questions, comments from you. We have John there is in the middle with a roving microphone. Yes, in the second row there, please.
Can you hear me? Yes. Murray Griffin. I'm a journalist from Australia with a news service called Footprint. One of the things in the report which seemed to me maybe completely new was the recommendation that companies should say what regulations they need to achieve net zero, and they should quantify what sort of, you know, how much emissions abatement actually can come with each of those regulatory measures. So I was hoping that you could expand a bit on how you arrived at that particular recommendation, and, you know, how you'd like to see companies approach it.
Would you like to take that, Jessica? That one?
Yeah, happy to start, and then Arunabha can come in. So one of the concerns was that companies, non-state actors, were setting recommendations were setting targets without really thinking through about what they needed, without being actually without being practical about what was feasible within the resource limits that they had, both financial, but also, let's call them policy resources. And so asking companies to be practical about, we need to get to 2050, and we're happy to get 2050, reduce emissions by X% by 2050. But given the current resources, given current technologies, this is what we could do. But if there was a good environment, if we had X, Y, and Z, then we could do this, is a way to be practical, to communicate to both your investors, to communicate to the public about what companies are actually willing to do and what they can do. But beyond that, we see it as a form of positive lobbying. It creates transparency about what companies need to do, and then it creates kind of that space where there's discussions about if we made this environment supportive, then companies could actually increase their ambition in a certain way. And so it's more like setting ambition and creating supportive regulatory environments for both non-state actors.
Arunabha, would you like to add anything to that? No, okay, great, thank you. Any more questions, comments?
Yeah, I've got one.
Yeah.
Well, we'll go with the Emily first, and then I'll come in after.
Thank you. My name's Emily Faint. I also work on the ISO Net Zero guidelines. My question was actually about the point from the recent IPCC report about 1.5 slipping out of our grasp, there no longer being a credible pathway. Do you feel in all of the data that you're seeing on progress being made, the communications around this topic, do you feel that global institutions are actually understanding that many of their processes are no longer fit for purpose, that things are taking too long, and that things need to be radically transformed rather than incrementally changed? Do you think that is happening, or do you think that message is continuing to not get through?
Angel, would you like to have a first go at that, or Tom?
Look, I think it's a really important question. The 1.5 goal was put into the Paris Agreement by the, efforts of the vulnerable countries, of the islands especially, of activists, against really the odds in 2015. And it was put there because, as the saying of the island states went, what's 1.5 to stay alive? So it's a promise in international law. It's an existential question for the vulnerable communities and pieces of people on our planet, and kind of a boundary for all of us to take very seriously. And it is sort of not just on life support, but on life support, slipping further away from us. But you also can see in those reports, not just the kind of current snapshot, but also the trend. And if you looked before Paris, the kind of scenarios that we were on in terms of pledges were thinking about something like a 4 or 5 degree world. And the kind of set of reports that came out recently from UNEP and Climate Action Tracker and others sort of show current policies being somewhere in the realm of sort of 2.5 degrees to 2.7, something like that. 2030 targets maybe bringing that down to 2.4, something around that realm. And if all countries and actors deliver on their long-term net zero targets, something like 1.6, 1.7, which is a really important step forward. And that last piece of it to me is key, because it means that if you deliver on these net zero pledges, if they're robust and if they're operationalized, we can get really, really, really far toward that 1.5 goal. So I think this is why implementation is the name of the game here in Sharm el-Sheikh.
Okay, John Lang, floor is yours.
This is for anyone who actually probably wants it. So we've heard about the recommendations and also about the stark realities. And we know that there's been global headwinds over the last year. So where are we actually seeing momentum? Are we seeing it at the corporate level? Are we seeing it at the subnational? Or are we seeing some green shoots at the country level? So yeah, interested to see what people think about where momentum is actually being generated at the moment.
Angel, is this one for you based on the, I mean, you're probably closer to the data than anyone else.
Yeah, and I also just wanted to touch on Emily's question because I think it's a really good one. I mean, I think everything that Tom said I wholly agree with, but I also feel like the situation is getting worse. And so it actually has become more challenging for us to meet the targets that we set. And so I think it's like in the political science literature, we call this the super wicked nature problem of climate change, where those who are trying to solve the problem are also those causing it. And so it's just kind of like one of these problems where we're trying to build the plane and fly it at the same time. And so I think that's also part of the challenge. And I think also what we're seeing is that I think there are some initiatives like Science-Based Targets Initiative that's trying to work with the companies to help them set these targets to align with 1.5 degree scenarios. But my understanding is that for a lot of the other non-state actors, that kind of translation has not really been done yet. And so a lot of them don't necessarily know, okay, well, what are the annualized reductions that I need to be hitting in order to actually keep in line with these different trajectories? And so we're hoping with this report that we're coming out on Tuesday, this will be a really stark reality check for a lot of these actors and to say, look, you're not on track, you're not aligned. Where can you really dig deep and try to, and what conversations, what stakeholders do you need to bring in to make that happen? Because what I always hear from the cities and the states and regions that they say, oh, well, these emissions are not in my control, they're out of my boundary. And it's like, okay, well then you need to make those bridges to try to make those conversations happen. So yeah, to John's question, I would say, the data, I mean, we're actually seeing some optimism on the company side. And so I think that that's really promising. And I think there's just been a lot more, I think, global conversation. And it'd be interesting to hear also from Arunabha and Jessica, whether or not in your discussions, whether or not there was also the feeling that there is just a lot more pressure being placed on companies or, and then maybe on the subnational side, there has, I was actually frankly shocked when we did the analysis on the cities and regions, how bleak the picture was looking. I was not expecting, we had conversations with the networks to say, are these numbers correct? We're seeing this huge nosedive, this huge reduction in pledges. Is this correct? Or is there data that we're missing? And they came back to us and they said, no, like this is frankly frustrating for us as well. So yeah, I would say for the companies, we're seeing some really good progress, and I think that's promising in some sectors, not in every sector. Tom mentioned the fossil fuel companies, but in other sectors, we're seeing some promising gains.
Jessica, I know you have to run to another appointment in a minute. Is there anything you'd care to add to that before you have to?
Yeah, so I think in our discussions at the HLEG, we were aware of pressure on small and medium-sized enterprises to set targets, but also on cities and regions, particularly those in developing countries and emerging markets. And so we recognize that there's need for measures to be put in place to avoid undue pressure, particularly on SMEs, but also to provide support to these institutions so that those who are willing to set targets, but also those that are required to reduce their emissions because of larger companies' scope 3 emission commitments can be able to do so without actually putting them in positions where they have to engage in unjust transitions. And so the just transition component recognizes that small and medium-sized enterprises, entities in developing countries, but also cities in developing countries will need financial and technical support to achieve those emission reductions.
Okay. Arunabha, anything to add?
I mean, I have a joint answer to both the questions, which is that what I'm not seeing is incentives. So I started off my interventions today in this panel talking about accountability. But accountability is not just regulation. The regulation can help to set the standards, etc., the disclosure norms and all of that stuff. But how are the incentives changing? Like what will a CFO or a CEO of a company encounter if the company does not deliver on its interim targets? I mean, in our recommendations, we said link executive compensation to it. But is that, even if that were to happen, is that enough? I think, and I think that's the challenge we're facing, that we come back to ambition loops without the accountability and the incentives to hold ourselves accountable, or the disincentives for inaction, right? And then you decide, whether that inaction is because of deliberate, obfuscation of your targets or deliberate inaction, or it's something that wasn't in your control. But at least to be able to then distinguish between the sincere efforts and the insincere announcements gives us a sense of how to hold individuals to account, individual companies to account. Without that, I'm afraid we will be looking more and more at charts that Angel has shown than the other way around.
Okay, a few minutes left. Yes, please, Troy.
Yeah, thank you. Is it working? Okay. Yeah, thank you so much to the panel, and again, congratulations on the HLEG report to Arunabha and Jessica. It was really quite a monumental moment, I think, here on Tuesday, so congratulations again to you both. So thank you so much for the presentation on the report, and I'm looking forward to seeing this, Angel. And I just wanted to ask a question because it was one of the clear recommendations in the HLEG report around offsets. And this has been a big conversation here this week. And one of the clear recommendations is that offsets are only for residual emissions. They are not for reductions in the main aspect of reducing emissions. So I'm just wondering, in terms of the positive messages, and I don't want to depress us even more on a Saturday night, but just in terms of the message that companies are making more progress, is that 1.5 alignment, basically have you assessed offsets in that setting? Because is the 1.5 alignment because offsets are a big part of that and maybe companies are using offsets more than cities and regions, or is that kind of real reductions? And I'm just kind of wondering what that means for the picture that we're seeing. Thanks.
Angel?
That's a really great question, and the issue also with the analysis is that, and I should have caveated it, it's only scope 1 and 2 emissions of companies, and so scope 3 is not even included. So that's a huge, yeah, you're right, I should have caveated that. Whoops. This is very new analysis. We're still trying to make sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, but that's a huge issue because a lot of companies, even though we are seeing improvement in scope 3 reporting, so as an example, CDP in 2010 only had around 896 companies that actually reported scope 3 emissions, and that number has tripled to over 3,000 companies that are now reporting, but a lot of them do not include information about the use of offsets, and a lot of them are not, so that's a really critical part. So we're only looking at scope 1 and 2. So that was a really key caveat that I forgot. So thank you so much, Dorian, for bringing that up because, it's really only. But Tom, I think maybe you want to say, because the Net Zero Tracker also has some really good data on both scope 3 and offsets.
Yeah, maybe just to add one data point, which you can also find for yourself on the Net Zero Tracker. Anyone who's interested, feel free to look. But something only like 1% of companies that have a net zero target have said they're not going to use, 1% of total companies, about 5 or 10% of the ones that have set net zero targets have said they're not going to use offsets at all, period. Maybe like 15% have said they're going to only use them under certain conditions. Many more have said, yes, they're going to use them and with no conditions, and a lot haven't even said if they're going to use them or not. So we just don't really know is the answer to do that analysis, which is to HLEG point, first tell us what the plan is, and then we can make the proper kind of assessment.
And it's probably worth saying that that's one of the aims of the Net Zero Tracker exercise, is to get companies and other entities actually to be specific with things that currently they're being vague about. I think we've got time to take one, maybe two more questions. Yes, Nicholas.
Yeah, hello, Niklas Höhne, New Climate Institute, also part of the Net Zero Tracker consortium. And I think one very important point is that one of urgency. No, we have no time to lose. We don't have time to make errors in all of this. So it's very good to see that we have these guidelines now from the standard and also from the high-level expert group. That's really good. But the next step is then to verify whether companies in particular are meeting these ones. And there the devil is in the detail. And in one report that we did, this Corporate Climate Responsibility Monitor, we looked into companies, and it's very, very difficult to find out whether they're actually following these recommendations or not. It's not straightforward. And we have so many companies out there that is a daunting task. So what's your recommendation, either from BSI or from the high-level expert group, on how we deal with that issue to really distinguish the ones that are doing it right and that really follow the recommendations from those that not and only display themselves better than they are?
Arunabha, would you have a thought on that, being from the HLEG?
I mean, thanks, Nicholas. My answer would be similar to what I said a little while earlier, and also what Tom was referring to. I mean, I want to see within the next, let's work backwards. We've said your interim targets need to begin from 2025, right? Next year is the global stock take. So what kind of architecture can we put in place between now and 2023 that gives us some confidence of what is going to be reported in 2025 to be a good one, right? And this is where the synchronization of the different data initiatives that are there needs to happen. I'm quite adamant that, you know, if we don't have that, we are not going to be able to be confident at all that we're not making mistakes. And the other one was if we can make some urgent moves on the regulatory standardization side, which would include the capacity building side of verifying the verifiers. Because the data and the analysts to analyze that data will be, you know, it's like, you know, you can set rules about crime, and if you don't have the police force in place, then, you know, there's no point, right? So that's the building block that's definitely needed. And to Angel's point about time running out, absolutely, I think what you're doing, this whole consortium of institutions doing the net zero tracker, I mean, let's collaborate now, not just at that level, but at that country level, at subnational level, to see how the methods that we're using can align quickly to demonstrate to these institutions, whether they're corporations or their cities or states, that we've got something that they can quickly use to start plotting out their economic development trajectories and then reporting accordingly. But it's the next 12 months that are absolutely critical. And I think we would have all failed, even as well-intentioned institutions, if we've not been able to make some move on that front by the stock take.
Right, thank you. We're going to leave it there because, okay, we can take one more quick one if you would. Sorry, I thought we were, okay.
Yeah, thanks very much. Gary Cook from Stand Earth. Question is, for now that the HLEG recommendations are out, what's the understanding or expectation for the what under the UN system? So it's UNFI and Fashion Charter. Are these recommendations can be rolled up and put in place for as a minimum criteria or for inclusion or participation in these bodies?
Who'd like to take that one, Tom?
I can speak to that from the perspective of the independent expert peer review group with the Race to Zero campaign, which is the umbrella for the high-level climate champions, have organized around those initiatives you mentioned. And absolutely, we see strong resonance between the HLEG report and the criteria that the campaign has developed over the last few years, and places where it's going to help us interpret those criteria in a more robust way, and where it's going to be a guide for and a lighthouse for all these initiatives going forward. So I fully expect that to be this ecosystem is now really cohering, as I was saying before, and that's going to have real implications for all of this action.
And one of the things we have to think about in the Net Zero Tracker operation is how much of this we can actually internalize in our operations, and therefore then we get to a stage where, to address Nicholas's point, if companies are actually not telling us and showing us that they're doing it, then they don't get a gold star for that one, because they need to show they're doing it as well as actually doing it. Okay, we're going to wrap up there. There are some refreshments at the back here, and I understand that you've got about 15 minutes before the next event starts in which to enjoy them. So finally, it just remains me to ask you to thank our panel, if you would, in the usual way. Jessica, who's had to leave, Arunabha, Dan, Tom, and Angel. Thank you for coming.